This baby understands bear. Emotions better than human feelings. His gift is unique. The morning mist hung low over the pine trees, so thick that Ethan Marshall could barely see 10 feet beyond the wooden porch where he stood with his coffee. The steam from his mug mixed with the fog, creating little swirls that disappeared into the white blanket surrounding their cabin. It was the kind of morning that made him wonder why they had waited so long to leave the city behind. The silence here was different from city quiet. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of something else, something that filled the spaces between heartbeats with a kind of ancient peace. Lily was inside with Jacob, their 3-month-old son, and through the window he could see her gently rocking the baby in her arms. Jacob was different from other babies they knew. Their friends' children filled their homes with constant crying, laughing, babbling, but Jacob was silent. Not the concerning silence of illness or distress, but a watchful, almost knowing quiet that sometimes made Ethan feel like their son was listening to something only he could hear. The doctors had run tests, checked his hearing, examined his vocal cords, and everything came back normal. Jacob could make sounds. He just chose not to. Sometimes Lily would spend hours trying to coax a giggle from him, making funny faces, playing peekaboo, singing silly songs that would have any other baby squealing with delight. Jacob would watch her with those deep brown eyes so much like his father's, but his expression remained serene, unchanged. It worried them both, though neither wanted to admit just how much. They had moved to this remote cabin in the mountains partly for the peace, partly to escape the constant comparisons to other babies, the well-meaning but hurtful comments from relatives about how their nephew was already saying "mama" at 2 months, or how their friend's daughter never stopped laughing. Here, surrounded by nothing but forest and sky, they could let Jacob be himself without the weight of expectations. The cabin itself was over 100 years old, built by someone who understood the value of solid wood and good craftsmanship. The walls were thick pine logs that had darkened with age to a rich amber color. Every floorboard creaked in its own unique way, creating a symphony of sounds that Ethan had learned to navigate in the dark during those late-night walks with Jacob when the baby couldn't sleep. Not that Jacob cried during those times either. He would simply lie awake, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, or out the window at the stars. Sometimes Ethan wondered what his son was thinking about during those quiet hours. Was he processing the world in a way that didn't require the constant vocalization other babies seemed to need? Or was there something else, something they couldn't understand? Lily appeared in the doorway. Jacob nestled against her shoulder. She had that tired but content look that had become her default expression since becoming a mother. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore one of Ethan's old flannel shirts over her pajamas. Even exhausted, she was beautiful to him. Maybe more so because he knew the weight she carried, the worry about their silent child that she tried so hard to hide. She joined him on the porch, and they stood together, looking out at the fog-shrouded forest. The trees seemed to go on forever, tall sentinels guarding secrets that had been kept for centuries. Sometimes, when the wind moved through them just right, it sounded like whispers, like the forest was trying to tell them something important if only they knew how to listen. That's when they saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the mist, a darker shape moving between the trees. Ethan's first instinct was to push Lily and Jacob back toward the door, but something made him pause. The shape moved with a deliberate slowness, not the quick, nervous energy of a deer or the skulking motion of a coyote. As it came closer, the fog parted like a curtain, revealing a massive black bear. It was easily 400 pounds, its fur glistening with moisture from the mist. every muscle in Ethan's body tensed. They had been warned about bears when they moved here, told to keep their garbage locked up, never to leave food outside, to make noise when hiking to avoid surprising them. But here was one, no more than 20 feet from their porch, and they had done nothing to attract it. The bear stopped at the edge of their small yard, where the maintained grass met the wild undergrowth of the forest. It sat down, an oddly human gesture that made it seem less threatening and more curious. Its dark eyes fixed on them, or more specifically on Jacob. Ethan could feel Lily trembling beside him, her arms tightening protectively around their son. He wanted to move, to get them inside, but he was afraid that any sudden motion might trigger the bear's predatory instincts. They were frozen in a tableau of mutual observation, predator and prey, though in that moment it was unclear who was which. Then Jacob laughed. It wasn't a small sound, not the tiny gurgle or coo that they had been desperately hoping to hear for months. It was a full, delighted laugh, the kind that came from deep in his belly, pure joy made audible. The sound was so unexpected, so impossible in that moment of tension, that both Ethan and Lily looked down at their son in shock. Jacob's face was transformed, his usually serene expression replaced by one of absolute delight. His tiny hands reached out toward the bear, grasping at the air as if trying to touch it across the distance. The bear tilted its massive head, and then, incredibly, it made a sound in response. Not a growl or a roar, but a soft, almost purring rumble that seemed to come from deep in its chest. The bear and the baby regarded each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear stood up, turned, and ambled back into the forest, disappearing into the mist as if it had never been there at all. Jacob's laughter faded to soft cooing sounds, and then he was quiet again, that familiar silence returning, as if the moment of vocalization had never happened. Ethan and Lily stood there, still frozen, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Their silent child had laughed for the first time, not at his mother's silly faces or his father's attempts at funny voices, but at a wild bear that by all rights should have terrified him. Inside the cabin, they sat at the kitchen table, Jacob in his high chair between them, and tried to make sense of it. Lily kept touching Jacob's face, as if to reassure herself that he was still the same baby, that the laugh hadn't been their imagination. Ethan found himself looking out the window every few minutes, half expecting to see the bear returning. They didn't talk much about it that day, both of them processing the strangeness of it in their own way. But that night, after Jacob had fallen asleep in his crib, they lay in bed and whispered their theories to each other. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe Jacob had been about to laugh anyway, and the bear's appearance was just timing. Maybe the sound the bear made wasn't in response to Jacob at all, but some other bear behavior they didn't understand. But deep down, they both knew these explanations didn't quite fit. There had been something in that moment, some kind of communication or recognition that defied logical explanation. Over the next few days, they found themselves watching the forest edge more carefully, hoping and fearing in equal measure that the bear would return. Ethan even set up a camera on the porch, thinking that if it happened again, at least they would have proof, though proof of what? He wasn't sure. Lily researched bears online, learning about their behavior, their intelligence, their surprising gentleness when not threatened. She read stories of bears that had formed unlikely friendships with humans, though nothing quite like what they had experienced. A week passed without incident. Jacob returned to his usual quiet self, watching the world with those knowing eyes but offering no more laughter, no more sounds beyond the occasional soft sigh. They began to think it had been a one-time thing. a strange anomaly in their already unusual life with their silent child. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon when Ethan was chopping wood and Lily was inside preparing lunch, the bear returned. This time, Ethan saw it approaching from a distance, that same deliberate walk, that same sense of purpose. He put down his axe slowly, carefully, and called softly to Lily. She came out carrying Jacob, and they waited. The bear took the same position at the edge of the yard, sitting down with that oddly human posture. This time, there was no fear, or at least less of it. There was something about the bear's demeanor, the way it kept its distance, the way it seemed to be waiting for something, that made it feel less like a threat and more like a visitor. Jacob's reaction was immediate. His whole body seemed to light up, his arms waving excitedly, and then came that laugh again, bright and clear in the afternoon air. The bear responded with that same soft rumble. And then something extraordinary happened. The bear lay down, rolling onto its back in the grass, paws in the air, in what could only be described as a playful gesture. Jacob's laughter intensified, becoming almost musical in its joy. Ethan found himself smiling despite the surreal nature of the situation. There was something pure about it, something that bypassed all his rational concerns about safety and danger. Lily took a step forward, still holding Jacob, and the bear rolled back onto its stomach, watching them approach. She stopped about 10 feet away, close enough that they could see the individual hairs on the bear's fur, the intelligence in its dark eyes. Jacob reached out his tiny hands, and the bear stretched its neck forward slightly, not enough to close the distance, but enough to acknowledge the gesture. They stayed like that for several minutes, the baby and the bear sharing some kind of wordless conversation that the adults could only witness but not understand. Then, as before, the bear stood up and walked away, but this time it paused at the tree line and looked back, as if making sure they were watching. After it disappeared, Lily and Ethan stood in the yard for a long time, Jacob quiet again in his mother's arms. They didn't need to discuss it this time. They both knew that something extraordinary was happening, something that defied explanation but felt important, vital even. The visits became regular after that. Every few days, always in the afternoon, the bear would appear. Sometimes it would sit, sometimes lie down. Once it even brought a stick and played with it while Jacob watched and laughed. Each time, Jacob's reaction was immediate and joyful, a stark contrast to his continued silence with his parents. They tried not to let it hurt. The fact that their son seemed more connected to a wild animal than to them. But late at night, when Jacob was asleep, they would admit to each other that it stung. Lily would cry sometimes, wondering what they were doing wrong, why their love wasn't enough to draw out their son's voice. Ethan started documenting the visits, not with a camera anymore, but in a journal. He wrote down the date, the time, the weather, what the bear did, how Jacob reacted. He looked for patterns, trying to apply some kind of scientific method to something that felt more like magic. He noticed that the bear never came when it was raining, that it stayed longer on sunny days, that it seemed to know when Jacob was napping and wouldn't appear during those times. It was as if the bear had learned their schedule, or perhaps more unnervingly, as if it could sense when Jacob was awake and ready for a visit. One day, about a month after the first encounter, something different happened. The bear arrived as usual, but this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, keeping close to its flanks, were 2 cubs. They were maybe 6 months old, round and playful, tumbling over each other as they followed their mother. Ethan's protective instincts flared immediately. A mother bear with cubs was dangerous, unpredictable. He started to move Lily and Jacob back toward the house, but Lily stopped him with a hand on his arm. She had noticed what he hadn't yet, that Jacob wasn't laughing. Instead, he was making a different sound, a soft, crooning noise, almost like a lullaby. The mother bear sat in her usual spot while the cubs explored the edge of the yard, never venturing too far from her. One of them, braver than its sibling, came closer to where the family stood. It was small enough that it looked more like a large dog than a bear, all fuzzy fur and oversized paws. Jacob's crooning continued, and the cub sat down, tilting its head as if listening. The other cub joined it, and soon both were sitting in front of Jacob like students before a teacher. The mother bear watched calmly, that same intelligent gaze that had become familiar to them. Jacob reached out his hand, and Lily, in a moment of either bravery or madness, took a step forward. The cubs didn't move, didn't show any sign of fear or aggression. When they were close enough, Jacob's tiny fingers brushed the fur of the nearest cub. The touch lasted only a second, but in that moment, Jacob made a sound they had never heard from him before, something between a sigh and a word, though what word it might have been they couldn't tell. The cubs made a similar sound in response, and then the mother bear stood up, made a low calling noise, and the cubs immediately returned to her side. They walked away together, the cubs looking back several times as if reluctant to leave. That night, Jacob was different, not drastically but noticeably. He made more sounds, not words or laughter, but small vocalizations as if he was practicing, testing his voice. He also seemed more aware of his parents, making eye contact more often, reaching for them in a way he hadn't before. It was as if the encounter with the cubs had awakened something in him, some understanding that connection was possible not just with the bears, but with his own kind as well. Lily held him for hours that evening, tears streaming down her face as he babbled softly against her shoulder. Sounds that meant nothing and everything all at once. The story of Jacob and the bears would have been enough to make their life in the mountains extraordinary, but it was only the beginning. As Jacob grew older, his connection to the bears deepened, but so did the mystery surrounding it. There were things about the cabin, about the land itself, that they hadn't known when they moved in. Stories that the locals in the nearest town, a 40-minute drive down the mountain, only shared in whispers. Stories about other children over the years who had shown similar gifts, similar connections to the wildlife that seemed impossible, even supernatural. It was Mrs. Henderson at the general store who first mentioned it, though she did so carefully, as if testing their reaction. She asked about Jacob, how he was adjusting to mountain life, and when Lily mentioned that he seemed to love watching the wildlife, the old woman's eyes sharpened with interest. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and asked if they had noticed anything unusual about the animal's behavior around him. When Ethan and Lily exchanged glances, unsure how much to reveal, Mrs. Henderson nodded as if their silence was answer enough. She told them about the Whitmore child from the 1960s who could supposedly call deer to him with just a whistle, and before that, the Patterson boy in the 1920s, who was said to understand the language of birds. But it was what she said next that really caught their attention. Their cabin, she said, had been built by a man named Theodore Bennett in 1892. He had come to the mountains after losing his wife and daughter to scarlet fever, seeking solitude and peace. But he had found something else in those woods, something that changed him. The locals said he developed an uncanny ability to communicate with the animals, particularly the bears. He lived there for 30 years, and in all that time, despite the dangers of mountain life, he was never harmed by any wild creature. When he died, peacefully in his sleep in 1922, they found journals filled with observations about animal behavior, things that scientists wouldn't discover and document for decades to come. The name Bennett stuck in Ethan's mind. Their son was Jacob Bennett, though Bennett was Lily's maiden name, which she had kept and passed on to their son. It seemed like too much of a coincidence, but when he researched it later, he could find no connection between Lily's family and Theodore Bennett. Still, the parallel was unsettling. That night, he searched the cabin more thoroughly than he had when they first moved in. In the attic, behind a loose board, he found a metal box, rusted with age but still intact. Inside were 3 leather journals, their pages yellowed and brittle, filled with cramped handwriting. Theodore Bennett's journals were a revelation. They didn't just document animal behavior. They described experiences that mirrored their own with Jacob. Theodore wrote about a bear he called Grandmother, who would visit him regularly, sitting at the edge of his yard just as their bear did. He wrote about the understanding that seemed to pass between them, a communication that transcended language. But most remarkably, he wrote about a theory he had developed, that certain places in the world were thin, where the boundary between human and animal consciousness was more permeable. He believed the land where he built his cabin was one such place, and that those who lived there long enough, or who were born there, could develop the ability to bridge that gap. Reading the journals by lamplight while Jacob slept and Lily dozed beside him, Ethan felt the hair on his arms stand up. Theodore described experiments he had conducted, sitting in silence for hours, trying to empty his mind of human thoughts and open himself to what he called the underlying current of consciousness that all living things shared. He wrote about moments of breakthrough, where he could sense the emotions of the animals around him, their fears, their joys, their simple needs. He also wrote about the children he had observed in town, the ones who showed signs of the gift, as he called it. He noted that it was strongest in the very young, those whose minds hadn't yet been fully shaped by human language and logic. The next morning, Ethan shared the journals with Lily. They read them together while Jacob played on a blanket on the floor, occasionally making his soft sounds. The more they read, the more things made sense. Jacob's silence wasn't a deficit. It was perhaps a different kind of communication, one that didn't require words. His connection to the bears wasn't random. It was part of something larger, older, that had been happening on this land for who knows how long. They wondered if they should be concerned, if they should take Jacob away from this place before the gift, if that's what it was became too strong. But watching him, seeing how content he was, how his whole being seemed to light up during the bear visits, they couldn't imagine depriving him of that connection. The bears continued to visit throughout the summer and into the fall. As the leaves changed color and the air grew crisp, the visits became longer, more complex. The mother bear would sometimes bring things, a particularly interesting stick, a pine cone, once even a fish she had caught, laying it at the edge of the yard like an offering. Jacob would examine these gifts with intense concentration, turning them over in his small hands, making his soft sounds that seemed to convey approval or interest. The cubs grew bolder, sometimes coming close enough that Jacob could touch them, though Lily and Ethan always kept a watchful eye, ready to intervene if necessary. One day in late September, something happened that changed everything. The bear family arrived as usual, but the mother was moving differently, favoring her right front paw. As she sat down, they could see a gash on her leg, not life-threatening but clearly painful. Jacob's reaction was immediate and unlike anything they had seen before. He began to cry, not the angry, demanding cry of a baby who wants something, but a mournful, empathetic sound that seemed to echo the bear's pain. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he reached toward the injured animal, his little body straining against Lily's hold. The bear made a low, rumbling sound and lay down, extending the injured leg as if showing it to Jacob. Without thinking, Lily walked closer, carrying Jacob, drawn by something she couldn't explain. When they were just a few feet away, close enough that Lily could smell the wild, musky scent of the bear's fur, Jacob stopped crying. He made a different sound, almost like humming, a soothing, rhythmic noise that seemed to calm not just the bear but everyone present. The bear's eyes, usually alert and watchful, began to droop, and its breathing slowed. It was as if Jacob was singing it a lullaby, though no words were involved. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, Jacob humming his wordless song, the bear resting, the cubs playing quietly nearby. When the bear finally stood up, it seemed to be moving better, though whether that was Jacob's doing or just the rest helping, they couldn't say. Before leaving, the mother bear did something she had never done before. She approached them directly, coming close enough that she could have easily reached them with her massive paws. Instead, she lowered her head and very gently, so gently it was barely felt, touched her nose to Jacob's outstretched hand. Then she gathered her cubs and left, disappearing into the forest that was preparing for winter. That night, Jacob spoke his first word. It wasn't Mama or Dada, as they had hoped, but friend, clear as a bell in the quiet of the cabin. He said it while looking out the window toward the dark forest, and they knew he was talking about the bears. After that, words came slowly but steadily. He didn't speak in the constant stream that other toddlers his age did, but when he did speak, his words were carefully chosen, meaningful. He would say happy when the bears visited, sad when they didn't come for several days, hurt when he saw a bird with a broken wing. As autumn turned to winter and the bears prepared for hibernation, their visits became less frequent. The last visit before the snow came was poignant. The whole family appeared, the mother and both cubs, but they didn't stay long. They sat at the edge of the yard as the first snowflakes began to fall, and Jacob waved goodbye, saying, "Sleep now," in his small, clear voice. The bears looked back once before disappearing into the forest, and somehow they all knew this was a farewell until spring. Jacob didn't cry, but he was quieter than usual for the next few days, spending long periods looking out the window at the snow-covered yard where his friends used to visit. Winter in the mountains was a different kind of isolation. The road to their cabin became nearly impassable after heavy snowfalls, and they would sometimes go weeks without seeing another person. But it didn't feel lonely, not really. They had each other, and Jacob continued to grow and develop in his unique way. He showed an understanding of the natural world that went beyond his years. He could predict weather changes hours before they happened, growing restless before storms, calm before clear days. He knew when animals were near, even when they couldn't be seen or heard, pointing to the window and saying deer or fox moments before one would appear. Ethan continued reading Theodore Bennett's journals, finding more and more parallels to their own experience. Theodore wrote about the winter months, when the obvious connections to the larger animals were dormant, but the subtler connections to smaller creatures became apparent. He described becoming aware of the mice in his walls, not as pests, but as fellow inhabitants of the cabin, each living their parallel lives. He wrote about the consciousness of trees, slower and deeper than animal awareness, but present nonetheless. Some of his writings verged on the mystical, and Ethan might have dismissed them as the fantasies of a lonely man if he hadn't been witnessing similar things with his own son. Jacob seemed to sense things that should have been impossible for him to know. One night, he woke up crying, saying, "Hurt, hurt," over and over. They couldn't understand what was wrong until the next morning, when they found a deer in their yard, its leg caught in some old fencing that must have been buried under the snow. The deer was exhausted, having struggled all night, and they could see where the wire had cut into its leg. Ethan carefully freed it, while Jacob watched from the window, making his humming sound until the deer limped away into the forest. Another time, Jacob refused to let them go outside, throwing an uncharacteristic tantrum when Ethan tried to leave for firewood. An hour later, they heard the crash of a tree falling right where Ethan would have been walking. As winter deepened, they discovered that Jacob's gift wasn't limited to animals. He seemed to have an intuitive understanding of people as well, though it manifested differently. When they did make trips to town for supplies, Jacob would react strongly to certain people, reaching out to some with obvious affection while shrinking away from others. At first, they thought it was just typical baby preferences, but they began to notice patterns. The people Jacob was drawn to were invariably kind, patient, genuine in their interactions. Those he avoided often proved to be difficult, dishonest, or harboring some hidden anger or pain. Mrs. Henderson at the general store became particularly fond of Jacob, always having a small treat ready for him when they visited. One day, she pulled Lily aside and told her more about the history of the mountain, about the indigenous peoples who had considered it sacred long before European settlers arrived. They had stories, she said, about children born with the ability to speak with all living things, children who were considered bridges between the human and natural worlds. These children were revered, protected, and their gifts were cultivated through specific practices and rituals. When the tribes were forced from the land, they said the gift would continue to manifest, but without proper guidance it could be both a blessing and a burden. This information weighed heavily on Lily and Ethan. They wanted to do right by their son, to help him develop his gift in a healthy way, but they had no roadmap, no guide except for the cryptic writings of Theodore Bennett and the fragments of indigenous wisdom that had survived in local stories. They did their best, encouraging Jacob's connection to nature, while also trying to help him develop normal human relationships and communication skills. It was a delicate balance, and they often felt like they were making it up as they went along. The winter solstice brought an unexpected event. Jacob had been restless all day, more vocal than usual, saying, "Coming, coming," repeatedly while looking out the window. They assumed he was hoping for an animal visitor, though most creatures were hidden away from the bitter cold. But as darkness fell early on the shortest day of the year, they saw lights in the forest. Not electric lights, but soft, moving glows like fireflies, impossible in the winter cold. Jacob pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass, and said a word they hadn't heard from him before. Family. The lights moved closer, and they could see they were being carried by people, lanterns held by a small group, making their way through the snow. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and went out to meet them, concerned that someone might be lost or in trouble, but the group knew exactly where they were going. There were 5 of them, all older, indigenous faces weathered by time and weather. They introduced themselves simply, not with full names but with single words: river, stone, sky, root, and song. They said they had come to see the child, the one who spoke the old language. Inside the warm cabin, the visitors sat in a circle on the floor, and without being asked, Lily brought Jacob to sit in the middle. The child showed no fear, only curiosity, reaching out to touch each person's hand in turn. The one, called Song, an elderly woman with silver hair braided down her back, began to hum, a low, rhythmic sound that wasn't unlike the humming Jacob made for the injured bear. One by one, the others joined in, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate in the very walls of the cabin. Jacob listened intently, then added his own voice, his childish hum somehow fitting perfectly into their ancient melody. They stayed for hours, not speaking much in English, but communicating nonetheless. Through gestures and a few translated words, They explained that they were keepers of the old knowledge, the last in their line who remembered the ways of those who could bridge the worlds. They had been watching, waiting for another child to be born with the gift. They couldn't teach him everything, they said, because much had been lost, but they could offer what they knew. They gave Lily a small leather pouch containing herbs and stones, things that would help Jacob stay grounded as his gift grew stronger. They warned that as he got older, the gift might become overwhelming if not properly channeled, that he might lose himself in the consciousness of others if he didn't learn to maintain his own boundaries. Before they left, Song took Lily's hands and spoke in accented but clear English. She said that Jacob was special, but not unique. Throughout history, there had been those who could hear the silent language, who could feel the connections between all living things. In the old days, these people became shamans, healers, guides. In modern times, they often struggled, their gifts dismissed as imagination or mental illness. But here, in this place where the veil was thin, Jacob could grow into his gift naturally. She said the bears knew this, that animals always recognize the bridge children. They would be his teachers as much as any human could be. After the visitors left, disappearing back into the snowy forest with their lanterns like a dream, the cabin felt different. Not empty, but charged with possibility. Jacob slept deeply that night, more peacefully than he had in weeks. Ethan and Lily sat up late, discussing what had happened, what it meant for their son's future. They realized that in seeking isolation they had found themselves at the center of something ancient and profound. Their son wasn't just different. He was part of a lineage that stretched back farther than they could imagine. The rest of the winter passed quietly. Jacob continued to grow, to speak more, though his words remained sparse and meaningful. He would spend hours at the window, watching the snow fall, occasionally making observations that seemed beyond his years. Trees sleeping, he would say, or ground thinking. They learned to listen to these pronouncements, to take them seriously rather than dismissing them as childish fancy. More often than not, Jacob's observations proved to have some truth to them, some insight into the natural world that they had never considered. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in patches, revealing the brown earth beneath. Jacob became increasingly excited as the days grew longer, saying, "Soon, soon," while looking toward the forest. They knew he was anticipating the return of the bears from their hibernation. Sure enough, on a warm April afternoon, the mother bear appeared at the edge of the yard. She was thinner after her long sleep, her fur patchy from shedding, but she moved with the same deliberate grace. The cubs, now yearlings and much larger, followed behind her. Jacob's joy at their return was infectious. He laughed and clapped, calling out, friend back," in his clear voice. The bears seemed equally pleased, the mother making a sound they hadn't heard before, almost like a purr. The reunion was touching but also different. Jacob was older now, more verbal, and his interaction with the bears had evolved. He would talk to them in full sentences, telling them about his winter, about the snow, about the people who had visited. The bears, of course, didn't understand the words, but they seemed to understand the intent, the emotion behind them. As spring turned to summer, the pattern of visits resumed, but with new dimensions. Jacob began to draw pictures of the bears, childish scribbles that somehow captured their essence. He would show these drawings to the bears themselves, holding them up proudly, and the mother bear would sniff them carefully, as if appreciating the effort. The cubs, now independent but still visiting with their mother, would sometimes play games with Jacob, a sort of hide-and-seek where they would disappear behind trees, and Jacob would point to where they were hiding, laughing when they emerged. One day, Ethan decided to test something. He had been thinking about Theodore Bennett's journals, about the experiments the old man had conducted. While Jacob was napping, Ethan sat at the edge of the yard where the bears usually appeared. He tried to empty his mind, as Theodore had described, to open himself to that underlying current of consciousness. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, gradually, he became aware of something. Not thoughts exactly, but impressions. The feeling of sunlight on fur, the satisfaction of a full belly, the constant vigilance for danger. When he opened his eyes, the mother bear was sitting not 10 feet away, watching him with those intelligent eyes. She stayed for only a moment before leaving. But Ethan felt like something had passed between them, some acknowledgement of his attempt to understand. He shared this experience with Lily, and she tried it herself with similar results. It seemed that living in this place, being around Jacob, was somehow opening their own perceptions. They weren't developing Jacob's level of gift, but they were becoming more aware, more attuned to the natural world around them. It was subtle, but undeniable. They found themselves knowing things they shouldn't know, like when storms were coming long before the weather forecast predicted them, or when animals were near even when hidden. It was as if Jacob's gift was somehow contagious, spreading to those around him in diluted form. The local community began to take notice of their unusual family. Word spread, as it always does in small mountain towns, about the child who could communicate with bears. Some people were skeptical, dismissing it as overactive imagination or coincidence. Others were curious, wanting to see for themselves. A few were concerned, worried about the safety of having wild bears so comfortable around humans. But most seemed to accept it as just another mystery of the mountains, another story to add to the collection of strange tales that had accumulated over the years. A researcher from the state university heard about Jacob and contacted them, wanting to study his interactions with the bears. Ethan and Lily were hesitant, not wanting their son to become a subject of scientific scrutiny, but the researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen, was respectful and genuinely interested in understanding rather than exploiting. She visited several times, always keeping her distance, observing without interfering. Her conclusions were cautious but fascinating. She noted that Jacob's presence seemed to alter the bear's behavior in measurable ways, that their stress hormones were lower when he was around, that they exhibited behaviors typically only seen between mother bears and their own cubs. Dr. Chen also introduced them to the concept of interspecies communication, a field of study that was gaining recognition in the scientific community. She explained that many researchers were beginning to accept that animals had forms of communication and consciousness far more complex than previously believed. Jacob, she suggested, might simply be naturally attuned to these forms of communication that most humans had lost the ability to perceive. She didn't try to explain it all away with science, acknowledging that there were aspects of Jacob's gift that defied current understanding. As Jacob grew older, approaching his second birthday, his abilities continued to evolve. He began to show an understanding not just of individual animals but of the ecosystem as a whole. He would become upset when trees were cut down on distant parts of the mountain, somehow sensing the disturbance. He could predict which plants would grow where, pointing to bare ground and saying, "Flowers soon," weeks before anything sprouted. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand the relationships between different species, the complex web of interactions that kept the forest in balance. One afternoon in late summer, something happened that would stay with them forever. Jacob was playing in the yard while Lily gardened and Ethan split wood. The bears hadn't visited for several days, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Suddenly, Jacob stood up and walked toward the forest, moving with purpose. Before his parents could stop him, he had entered the tree line. They followed quickly, calling his name, fear rising in their throats. They found him about 50 yards in, standing in a small clearing they had never noticed before. In the clearing were not just the 3 bears they knew, but dozens of animals. Deer, foxes, rabbits, even a few coyotes, all sitting or standing peacefully together, natural enemies side by side without aggression. At the center was Jacob, his arms outstretched, turning slowly in a circle as if conducting an invisible orchestra. The animals watched him with what could only be described as reverence. Then Jacob began to hum, that same soothing sound he made for injured creatures, but louder, more complex. The animals began to move, not fleeing but arranging themselves in what looked like deliberate patterns, prey animals interspersed with predators, creating a living mandala in the forest clearing. Lily grabbed Ethan's arm, her nails digging into his skin, both of them frozen by the impossibility of what they were seeing. This wasn't just communication. This was something else, something that touched on the mystical, the spiritual. Jacob continued his humming for several minutes, the animals remaining in their formation. Then he stopped, lowered his arms, and walked back to his parents as if nothing unusual had happened. The animals dispersed slowly, each returning to their normal behaviors, predators and prey once again separate, the spell broken. They never spoke of that incident to anyone, not even Dr. Chen. It felt too private, too sacred to share. But it changed how they thought about Jacob's gift. He wasn't just able to communicate with animals. He was somehow able to access and influence something fundamental about consciousness itself, the shared awareness that connected all living things. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. They worried about what would happen as he grew older, whether this gift would isolate him from human society, or whether he would find a way to bridge both worlds. The bears continued to visit through the fall, but their behavior had changed after the gathering in the clearing. They showed even more deference to Jacob, the mother bear sometimes lowering her head when he approached, as if acknowledging his special status. The cubs, now almost fully grown, would still play with him, but more gently, more carefully, as if they understood his importance. Jacob, for his part, seemed to have crossed some threshold. He was more confident, more certain of his place in the world. He still didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight beyond his years. One day, as the leaves were turning gold and red, Jacob said something that chilled them. He was watching the bears play at the edge of the yard when he turned to his parents and said, "They know winter's different this time." When they asked what he meant, he just shook his head and said, "Sleeping longer." They didn't understand until the first snows came earlier than usual, heavier than anyone could remember. The old-timers in town said it was going to be the hardest winter in decades, and somehow the animals had known, had prepared. The bear's last visit before hibernation was emotional. The mother bear came close, closer than she ever had when Ethan and Lily were present. She stood on her hind legs, towering over them, but there was no threat in it. She placed one massive paw gently on Jacob's head, a gesture so human-like it took their breath away. Then she dropped back to all fours, gathered her cubs with a soft call, and walked into the forest. Jacob waved goodbye, tears streaming down his face, but he didn't call them back. "See them in dreams," he said, which they didn't understand until later. That winter was indeed brutal. Snow fell in feet rather than inches. The temperature dropped to record lows, and they were truly isolated for weeks at a time. But Jacob seemed unaffected by the isolation. He would sit by the window for hours, not looking out but with his eyes closed, humming softly. When they asked what he was doing, he said he was visiting, They realized he meant he was somehow connecting with the hibernating bears, sharing their dreams or consciousness in some way they couldn't fathom. Sometimes he would laugh suddenly or make a concerned sound, reacting to something only he could perceive. Theodore Bennett's journals became their guide through that long winter. In his later writings, Theodore described similar experiences, what he called dream-walking with the animals. He believed that in sleep, the barriers between consciousnesses became thinner, more permeable. He wrote about sharing the dreams of hibernating bears, experiencing their memories of summer, their deep, slow thoughts during the long sleep. Ethan and Lily tried to understand, to support Jacob through these experiences, but they often felt out of their depth, unable to fully grasp what their son was going through. 2 chapters of Part 1 completed. The winter deepened, bringing with it a silence that seemed to press against the windows of the cabin. Jacob had grown quieter too, but it was a different kind of quiet from his early infant days. This was the quiet of someone listening to something far away, or perhaps far within. He would sit for hours with his hand pressed against the cold window glass, his eyes unfocused, his breathing slow and rhythmic, like someone in meditation. Sometimes his lips would move, forming words they couldn't hear, having conversations with invisible companions. Lily would watch him during these times, torn between wonder and worry, unsure if she should interrupt these strange communions or let them continue. It was during one of these sessions that Jacob said something that changed everything. He opened his eyes suddenly, looking directly at his mother, and said in his clear, small voice, "The old bear is coming." The one from before. They didn't understand what he meant until 3 days later when a massive bear appeared at the edge of their property. This wasn't their familiar mother bear or her cubs. This bear was ancient, its muzzle completely gray, its movements slow and deliberate with age. It was the largest bear they had ever seen, despite its obvious age, and there was something in its eyes that spoke of decades of wilderness wisdom. The old bear didn't follow the patterns they had grown accustomed to. It didn't sit at the edge of the yard or wait for Jacob to acknowledge it. Instead, it walked directly to the cabin, stopping just feet from the porch where Jacob stood watching through the glass door. The bear and the child regarded each other for a long moment, and then the bear did something extraordinary. It stood on its hind legs and placed both paws against the door, matching Jacob's small hands on the other side of the glass. They stayed like that, palm to paw, for several minutes, and Ethan could swear he saw something pass between them, some kind of energy or information that transcended normal understanding. When the bear finally lowered itself back to all fours and walked away, Jacob turned to his parents with an expression they had never seen on his young face. It was ancient, knowing, almost sad. "He remembers the first one," Jacob said. "The man who built this house. They were friends." The implications of this statement were staggering. If this bear had known Theodore Bennett, it would have to be at least 40 years old, perhaps older, which was almost unheard of for a wild bear. But looking at the ancient creature disappearing into the forest, they could believe it. That night, Ethan went back to Theodore's journals with new purpose, looking for any mention of a particular bear. He found it in the final volume, entries from Theodore's last years. Theodore wrote about an old bear he had known since it was a cub, a bear he called Grandfather, though he admitted the bear was likely female. He described their relationship evolving over decades, from mutual wariness to something approaching friendship. In his final entry, written just days before his death, Theodore expressed hope that Grandfather would live on, would perhaps one day meet another human who could understand the old language. The thought that they were living in a cabin built by a man who had experienced something similar to what their son was going through and that the same bear, or perhaps its descendant, was now connecting with Jacob, created a sense of continuity that was both comforting and overwhelming. They were part of something larger, a story that had been unfolding for over a century, perhaps much longer. The indigenous visitors had suggested as much, that this place had always been special, had always produced those who could bridge the worlds. As winter wore on, the old bear became a regular visitor, though never as predictable as the younger bears had been. Sometimes it would appear in the middle of the night, and they would wake to find Jacob standing at the window, his hand pressed against the glass, the bear on the other side matching his posture. Other times it would come during the day, and Jacob would go outside, bundled in his winter clothes, and sit in the snow near the bear. They would stay like that, silent and still for sometimes an hour or more, two figures against the white landscape, communicating in ways that required no words or movement. During one of these sessions, something remarkable happened. Jacob had been sitting with the old bear for about 30 minutes when other animals began to appear. First, a fox emerged from the trees, then several rabbits, a pair of deer, even a mountain cat that should have sent the smaller animals fleeing. But instead of the natural fear and flight that should have occurred, the animals arranged themselves in a circle around Jacob and the bear, all facing inward, all perfectly still. It was like the gathering in the clearing months before, but more organized, more deliberate. Jacob began to hum, but this time the sound was different, deeper despite his young voice, more complex in its tones. The animals responded, each in their own way. The fox yipped softly, the deer stamped gently, the rabbits thumped the ground in rhythm. Even the old bear added its voice, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sound they created together wasn't music exactly, but it had a harmony to it, a rightness that made Ethan and Lily's eyes fill with tears as they watched from the window. This wasn't just communication, it was communion, a sharing of something essential and profound. When it ended, the animals dispersed as quietly as they had come, leaving only Jacob and the old bear. The bear stood slowly, its age showing in the effort, and did something they had never seen any of the bears do before. It walked to Jacob and wrapped its massive arms around him in what could only be described as a hug. Jacob, tiny in comparison, hugged back, his small arms barely reaching around the bear's neck. They stayed that way for a moment that felt eternal. Then the bear released him and walked away without looking back. Jacob came inside, his cheeks red from the cold, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He said goodbye, Jacob told them. He's going to the long sleep. They understood what he meant, though they hoped they were wrong. But 3 days later, during a brief thaw, Ethan found the old bear's body at the base of a large pine tree, about a quarter-mile from the cabin. It had died peacefully, curled up as if sleeping, covered by a light dusting of snow. When he told Jacob, the boy nodded solemnly. He was ready, Jacob said. He waited to say goodbye. They debated what to do about the body, whether to report it to the wildlife authorities or let nature take its course. In the end, Jacob made the decision for them. He insisted on visiting the site, and when they arrived, they found that other animals had already been there. Not to feed, but to pay respects, it seemed. There were tracks all around the body, but it was undisturbed. Jacob knelt in the snow beside the great bear and sang a song they had never heard before, wordless but beautiful, full of gratitude and farewell. As he sang, animals appeared again, watching from the trees, adding their own voices in subtle ways. After Jacob's song ended, something extraordinary happened. Ravens began to arrive, dozens of them, more than should have been in the area. They landed in the trees around the bear's body, cawing in unison, creating a cacophony that somehow sounded like a funeral dirge. Then, as if by signal, they all took flight at once, circling 3 times before disappearing into the gray winter sky. It was, Ethan realized, a funeral, a ritual of mourning conducted by the forest itself for one of its own. The loss of the old bear marked a change in Jacob. He became more talkative, as if the bear's death had released him from some obligation to remain silent. He began to tell them things about the animals, about the forest, that he couldn't have known through normal observation. He knew which trees were sick before they showed signs, which animals were pregnant before their bodies changed, where to find the first spring flowers while snow still covered the ground. His knowledge wasn't learned. It was received, downloaded directly from the living network of consciousness that surrounded them. Dr. Chen visited again in late winter, having heard about the gathering of animals from someone in town who had witnessed part of it. She was excited but cautious, understanding the delicate nature of what was happening. She brought with her a colleague, Dr. Marcus Webb, who specialized in consciousness studies and had theories about morphic fields and collective awareness that might explain some of what Jacob was experiencing. But even these scientists, open-minded as they were, struggled to fully accept what they witnessed when Jacob demonstrated his abilities. During their visit, Jacob casually mentioned that there was an injured owl in a tree about a half-mile north. Dr. Webb was skeptical, but they hiked to the location Jacob described, and there, exactly where he said it would be, was a great horned owl with a damaged wing. Jacob approached it slowly, humming his healing song, and the owl, which should have been defensive and aggressive, allowed him to touch it, to examine the wing. He couldn't heal it magically, but he kept it calm, while Dr. Chen, who had some veterinary training, splinted the wing. The owl stayed with them for several weeks, recovering in a large cage Ethan built, and Jacob would sit with it for hours, apparently engaged in some kind of communication. One evening, while the owl was still recovering, Jacob made an announcement at dinner. "More children are coming," he said, "like me. The forest is calling them." Ethan and Lily exchanged glances, unsure what to make of this prediction. But sure enough, within a month, they received a call from Mrs. Henderson at the general store. A family had moved to the mountain, she said, with a young daughter who was different, in ways that reminded her of Jacob. The family was struggling, confused by their daughter's behavior, her strange connection to animals, her periods of silence followed by bursts of impossible knowledge. The family, the Carters, lived about 5 miles away, and when Ethan and Lily visited with Jacob, they found a situation remarkably similar to their own. Their daughter, Emma, was 4 years old, a year older than Jacob, and she had been displaying unusual behaviors since birth. She would stare at empty spaces and laugh, as if seeing invisible playmates. Animals were drawn to her, birds landing on her shoulders, squirrels approaching without fear. But unlike Jacob's parents, the Carters were frightened, considering medical intervention, therapy, anything to make their daughter normal. The meeting between Jacob and Emma was extraordinary. The 2 children looked at each other for a long moment. Then Emma smiled. The first genuine smile her parents had seen in months. Without speaking, the 2 children sat down facing each other and began to hum in harmony, creating a sound that made everyone in the room feel strangely peaceful. After a few minutes, Emma looked up at her parents and spoke in complete sentences for the first time. "I'm not broken. Jacob knows. The animals know. I'm just different." This began a friendship that would shape both children's lives. The families began meeting regularly, and watching Jacob and Emma together was like watching 2 halves of a whole reconnect. They would play games that made no sense to the adults, sitting silently and then suddenly laughing at the same moment, pointing at things only they could see. When they were together, their abilities seemed amplified. Animals would come closer, in greater numbers. The very air around them seemed to shimmer with possibility. Emma's gift was different from Jacob's in subtle ways. While Jacob seemed to communicate emotion and intent with animals, Emma could sense their physical states with uncanny accuracy. She knew when animals were sick, where they were injured, what they needed to heal. Together, the two children began what could only be described as a practice, helping injured animals, guiding lost ones home, sometimes just sitting with creatures that were dying, offering comfort in their final moments. The local wildlife began to learn that the two cabins were safe places, and it wasn't unusual to find injured or sick animals waiting near their homes, somehow knowing help was available. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came, it brought with it the return of the bear family. The mother bear was back, her cubs now fully grown, and likely off establishing their own territories. She seemed older, more tired, but still maintained that dignified presence they had come to know. Her first visit was emotional. She went straight to the spot where the old bear had died, now covered with new growth, and sat there for a long time. Jacob joined her, sitting quietly beside the massive creature, one small hand resting on her fur. "She misses him too," Jacob explained later. He was her father. This revelation added another layer to the complex web of relationships they were discovering. The bears weren't just random visitors. They were a family with their own history, their own losses and connections that had become intertwined with the human families on the mountain. The continuity stretched back generations, both human and ursine, creating a shared story that transcended species boundaries. As the weather warmed, more families with gifted children found their way to the mountain. It wasn't a flood, just a trickle, but by midsummer, there were 5 families within a 10-mile radius, each with a child who displayed some version of the gift. Some could sense weather patterns days in advance. Others could find water sources with uncanny accuracy. One boy could apparently communicate with plants, knowing which were medicinal, which were poisonous, which were ready to harvest. It was as if the mountain was calling to these children, drawing them to a place where their gifts could flourish without judgment. The informal community that formed was unlike anything any of them had experienced. The parents, initially isolated by their children's differences, found comfort in shared experience. They would meet weekly, sharing strategies for nurturing their children's gifts while still helping them function in the regular world. The children, freed from the burden of being the only one, blossomed. They taught each other, learned from each other, their different abilities complementing and enhancing one another. Dr. Chen and Dr. Webb became regular visitors, documenting what they were witnessing with a combination of scientific rigor and open-minded wonder. They brought in other researchers, carefully vetted to ensure they would respect the children and their families, not treat them as curiosities or lab subjects. Slowly, carefully, they began to build a body of evidence that suggested human consciousness was far more complex and connected than mainstream science acknowledged. The children weren't anomalies. They were perhaps throwbacks to an earlier way of being human or harbingers of a future evolution. One researcher, Dr. Amelia Foster, who specialized in indigenous knowledge systems, provided a framework that helped make sense of what was happening. She explained that many indigenous cultures had always known about these gifts, had cultivated them, had built entire worldviews around the understanding that consciousness was shared, that the boundaries between self and other were more fluid than Western thought acknowledged. The children on the mountain were naturally accessing what shamans and mystics had trained for years to achieve: direct communion with the living world. But it wasn't all wonder and harmony. As word spread about the gifted children on the mountain, They began to attract attention of different kinds. Religious groups arrived, some calling the children blessed, others claiming they were possessed. New Age enthusiasts came seeking wisdom or healing. Skeptics came to debunk what they saw as fraud or delusion. The families found themselves having to protect their children from those who would either worship or study them, neither of which was healthy for young minds still developing their sense of self. It was Jacob who proposed the solution. Despite being only 3.5 years old, he had a wisdom that sometimes startled even his parents. "We need to hide," he said one evening, after a particularly intrusive visitor had upset Emma. "Not go away, just be quiet about the special things." The families agreed, becoming more selective about who they allowed to witness the children's abilities. They continued to work with the researchers they trusted, but they stopped accepting every curious visitor. They learned to present a facade of normalcy when necessary, the children instinctively understanding when to suppress their gifts and when it was safe to express them. The mother bear, who had continued her regular visits throughout the spring and summer, seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. She became more cautious, only appearing when strangers weren't around, as if she too understood the need for discretion. Her bond with Jacob had evolved into something that transcended even their unusual interspecies friendship. She would sometimes bring him gifts, unusual stones, or particularly beautiful feathers she had found. He would reciprocate with drawings, which she would sniff carefully before gently taking them in her mouth and carrying them away to some secret den. One day, in late summer, the mother bear arrived with urgent energy, pacing at the edge of the yard, making low, anxious sounds. Jacob immediately understood. "Fire," he said, though there was no smoke, no sign of danger. But he had learned to trust the bear's warnings. Ethan called the Forest Service feeling foolish, reporting a possible fire based on his son's interpretation of a bear's behavior. But 3 hours later, smoke appeared on the horizon. A lightning strike had started a fire 10 miles away, and because of the early warning, the Forest Service was able to contain it before it spread to the populated areas of the mountain. This incident brought a new level of respect from the local community. The fire could have been devastating, could have destroyed homes and lives. That it was prevented by a 3-year-old boy interpreting a bear's warning was either miraculous or insane, depending on perspective, but the results were undeniable. The sheriff, a practical man named Tom Bradley, who had been skeptical of the stories about Jacob, became a quiet supporter, understanding that whatever was happening with these children, it had practical value for the community's safety. As autumn approached, Jacob began to show signs of a new development in his abilities. He started having what he called far dreams, visions or connections with animals nowhere near the mountain. He would wake up talking about whales in the ocean, elephants in distant lands, great flocks of birds migrating across continents. At first, his parents thought it was just imagination fueled by picture books, but the detail and consistency of his descriptions suggested something more. He knew things he couldn't have learned from books, like the specific feeling of sonar passing through water, the weight of tusks, the magnetic pull that guided migration. Dr. Webb was fascinated by this development, seeing it as evidence for his theories about non-local consciousness. He believed that consciousness wasn't confined to the brain, that it was a field phenomenon that could, under certain circumstances, transcend spatial limitations. Jacob and the other gifted children were somehow able to tap into this field more easily than most humans. The implications were staggering, suggesting a fundamental interconnection of all conscious beings that mystics had long claimed, but science had never been able to prove. Emma was developing her own expanded abilities. She had begun to sense not just the physical state of animals but their emotional histories. She could touch a tree and know every creature that had nested in it, every storm it had weathered. She could hold a feather and tell you about the bird's life, its migrations, its mate, its offspring. It was overwhelming at times, and she would have to wear gloves to avoid being flooded with information from every surface she touched. Her parents learned to create quiet spaces for her, rooms with new objects that carried no history, where she could rest from the constant influx of information. The other children on the mountain were similarly evolving. Marcus, the boy who could communicate with plants, had begun to influence their growth, encouraging vegetables to grow larger, flowers to bloom longer. Sarah, who could sense weather patterns, was now able to predict them weeks in advance with startling accuracy. Little Tommy, only 2 years old, seemed to be able to heal minor injuries in animals just by touching them, though the effort exhausted him. Each child's gift was unique, but they all shared that fundamental ability to transcend the normal boundaries of human perception. The families decided to start a small school, recognizing that their children needed education tailored to their unique abilities. They hired a teacher, Ms. Elena Rodriguez, who had experience with gifted children and an open mind about what gifted might mean. She created a curriculum that included traditional subjects, but also meditation, nature observation, and what she called consciousness studies. The children thrived in this environment, learning not just facts, but how to manage and direct their unusual abilities. The school attracted the attention of education reformers and child development specialists. Some saw it as a model for nurturing different kinds of intelligence, others as a dangerous deviation from proven educational methods. But the children's progress was undeniable. They were learning to read and write ahead of schedule, showed advanced understanding of mathematical concepts, and displayed emotional intelligence far beyond their years. Whether this was due to their gifts or the specialized attention they received was debatable, but the results spoke for themselves. As winter approached again, Jacob made another prediction that proved significant. He told his parents that this winter would bring the gathering, though he couldn't or wouldn't explain what that meant. They prepared as best they could, stocking up on supplies, reinforcing the cabin against storms. The other families did the same, trusting in Jacob's visions even if they didn't understand them. The bears made their final pre-hibernation visits, and Jacob spent long hours with the mother bear, their foreheads touching in what had become their traditional farewell. The first snow came early, and with it came visitors of a different sort. Animals began appearing at all the gifted children's homes, not injured or seeking help, but simply present. Deer bedded down in yards, foxes denned under porches. Birds roosted in unusual numbers in nearby trees. It was as if the animal population of the mountain was gathering around the children, seeking proximity to them for reasons unknown. The families, now accustomed to unusual animal behavior, accepted these visitors, setting out food when necessary, ensuring water sources didn't freeze. Then came the night Jacob had been anticipating. It was the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, and all the gifted children woke at the same moment, drew to their windows by something only they could sense. The aurora borealis, rarely visible this far south, painted the sky in sheets of green and gold. But more than that, the children claimed they could hear it, a music that played not in their ears but in their minds, a harmony that connected every living thing under its light. They stood at their windows, some of them miles apart, and hummed in unison, adding their voices to the cosmic chorus only they could hear. The parents, watching their children, saw something that defied explanation. The aurora seemed to respond to the children's humming, pulsing and swirling in rhythm with their voices. The gathered animals all faced the same direction, toward the sky, as if they too were participating in this moment of connection. Even the sleeping bears, deep in their dens, were said later by the children to have been present in some way, their slow dreams adding a bass note to the symphony of consciousness that played out under the northern lights. When it ended, when the aurora faded and the children returned to their beds, something had changed. The children were different, not dramatically but subtly. Their abilities were stronger, more controlled, but more than that, they seemed to carry with them a sense of purpose, an understanding of why they had these gifts. Jacob, when asked about it the next morning, said simply, "We're the bridge for what's coming." When pressed about what was coming, he would only smile and say, "Good things. Hard things, necessary things." The winter that followed was one of deep learning and preparation. The children spent more time together, teaching each other, developing what could only be described as protocols for their abilities. They created a kind of sign language for communicating with animals, combining gestures with sounds that seemed to be universally understood across species. They developed meditation techniques for managing the flow of information that came with their expanded awareness. They learned to shield themselves when necessary, to avoid being overwhelmed by the constant stream of non-human consciousness that surrounded them. The parents, guided by the children's insights and the researchers' theories, began to document everything more systematically. They created journals, not unlike Theodore Bennett's, recording not just events but patterns, connections, the slow revelation of a world far more interconnected than most humans realized. They began to see their role not just as parents, but as guardians of a knowledge that might be crucial for humanity's future relationship with the natural world. Spring came with a surprise. The mother bear emerged from hibernation with a new cub, tiny and black, following close behind her. But this cub was different from her previous offspring. From its first visit, it showed an unusual focus on Jacob, ignoring the typical cub distractions to sit quietly near him, mimicking his postures, his stillness. The mother bear seemed to encourage this, nudging the cub toward Jacob when it wandered, as if she was deliberately fostering a connection between them. Jacob named the cub Echo, saying it was the sound that comes back changed. The name proved apt, as Echo seemed to mirror not just Jacob's movements but his moods, his intentions. When Jacob was calm, Echo was calm. When Jacob was excited about something, Echo would display similar energy. It was as if the cub was learning how to be a bridge itself, translating between bear and human consciousness in a way that even its mother hadn't achieved. The relationship between Jacob and Echo became the focus of intense study by Dr. Chen and her team. They documented behavioral synchronicities that shouldn't have been possible, moments when the two would react to the same stimulus simultaneously despite being separated by distance or barriers. They recorded vocalizations from Echo that were unlike typical bear sounds, seeming to approximate the tones of Jacob's humming. Most remarkably, they observed Echo apparently teaching other young animals, gathering them and demonstrating behaviors that Jacob had shown him. As the seasons turned and the children grew, their influence on the mountain ecosystem became increasingly apparent. The wildlife population was thriving in unusual ways. Predator-prey relationships seemed more balanced, with less starvation but also less overpopulation. Plants grew in patterns that maximized their mutual benefit. It was as if the children's presence was helping the ecosystem find a more harmonious balance, their consciousness acting as a kind of organizing principle that helped different species coordinate their activities for mutual benefit. But the most significant change was in the human community. The families of gifted children had created something unprecedented, a modern village that lived in genuine harmony with its environment. They had learned to make decisions based not just on human needs, but on the needs of the entire ecosystem they were part of. When they needed to build or clear land, the children would communicate with the affected animals, helping them relocate, ensuring minimal disruption. When they hunted or gathered, they did so with an understanding of what the forest could spare, guided by the children's ability to sense the health and population of different species. This way of living attracted attention from environmentalists and sustainability experts. Here was a community that had achieved what many had thought impossible: true, sustainable living that didn't require a sacrifice of modern comforts, but rather a fundamental shift in how humans related to their environment. The children weren't just gifted, they were guides, showing a way forward that could potentially address some of the most pressing environmental challenges facing the world. As Jacob approached his 4th birthday, his abilities had stabilized into something remarkable but manageable. He could still communicate with animals, still sense the emotional and physical states of creatures around him, but he had learned to control the flow of information, to choose when to open himself to the wider consciousness and when to focus on his human life. He was learning to read and write, played with toys like any child, laughed at cartoons, but he also spent hours in wordless communion with Echo and the other animals, facilitating what seemed to be important communications between species. One day, while sitting with Echo at the edge of the forest, Jacob turned to his parents with an expression of profound contentment. "This is why we're here," he said, his young voice carrying certainty beyond his years. "To remember what everyone forgot, that we're all one thing, just wearing different shapes." He reached out and touched Echo's fur with one hand, and his father's hand with the other, and for just a moment, Ethan could swear he felt it too, the connection, the underlying unity that his son lived with every day. The story of the gifted children on the mountain would continue to unfold for years to come. Some would grow up to become scientists, using their abilities to advance human understanding of consciousness and ecology. Others would become healers, veterinarians, conservationists, using their gifts in practical ways to help both humans and animals. A few would struggle, finding the weight of their abilities too heavy, the constant awareness of suffering in the natural world too painful to bear. But all of them would carry forward the knowledge that consciousness was vaster, more interconnected, more miraculous than most humans ever realized.